all about trial and error, right? The more you try, the better you get. Okay. Now, before we discuss more functions of DOM, we know about one function of DOM. To get more interactivity into our application, there is something called as event-driven programming. Now, this is a very important concept. What is event-driven programming? And technically, what is the meaning of this word event altogether? Okay. So, in most of the applications, whatever you see, like you use Zomato, you use Book My Show, you use Google.com, whatever you see, everywhere you will see one common thing happening. That when you interact with the application, then something happens. When you click on the button, something happens. When you hover on the page, something happens. When you scroll, something happens, and so on, right? And so on. So events actually refer to the actions that a user actually executes on the page. And what is event-driven programming? Event-driven programming is a paradigm of programming where once the user initiates an action, then you execute a corresponding response. This kind of an architecture is called as event-driven programming. So let's start talking about it. Okay, let's start talking about it. So, okay, we will say to understand event-driven programming, we need to understand concept of events first. Okay, so to understand this, we need to first of all understand that what is the meaning, what is the actual meaning of events, because the whole infrastructure of this is going to be dependent on this concept of event altogether. That what is event and how exactly event is going to make any difference altogether. Okay, so events are some action or interaction done by an external agent, maybe the user. Right? Events are some action or interaction done by the external agent on our application. For example, clicking a button is an action or is an event. Scrolling is an event. Moving the mouse is an event. Clicking, or I should say pressing a button on keyboard is an event, and so on. Okay, so any interaction that you do, because your web application cannot automatically make a mouse click, right? Your web application cannot automatically press your keyboard keys, right? So it's gonna be something that is done by some external agent, maybe the user. So whenever you try to interact, when you press a key, you scroll, you click something, right? That's what we call as event. That's what we call as event. When we click a button, that's an event that is triggered. Okay, so when we click a button, an event is triggered, right? So you can say it's kind of like an action. And when this action happens, we have to give a reaction. Okay, we have to give a reaction. To react on these actions, we can write logics which will only execute when these actions are triggered. When these actions are triggered. And the programming methodology or programming paradigm where the logic / code runs as a reaction / response to these events is called as event-driven programming. Okay, it's called as event-driven programming. Okay, so as I mentioned, that clicking a button, scrolling over the page, when you do anything on the page, you interact with the page, that's an event. And when an event is triggered, if you bind that event with some kind of a code logic, some kind of an instruction, that these instructions will be executed once that event happens. If that event never happens, this logic never executes. But if that event happens, this logic executes. This methodology, this kind of a coding is called as event-driven programming. Okay, it's called as event-driven programming. Let me show you with an example. So there is a method called as document.addEventListener. Okay, document.addEventListener. This method, not document.addEventListener. It's kind of like element.addEventListener, right? Element.addEventListener. Okay. This method, addEventListener, is present on almost all of the HTML elements, right? Right. We can select an HTML element first and then call this addEventListener function on that element, right? One second. Let's not call it like angle brackets. Let's say HTML element.addEventListener. Okay. Okay. So we can first select the HTML element and then call this addEventListener function on that element. It takes two arguments. The first argument is the name of the event. Example, click. If you want to do double click, so DBL click, mouse over, scroll, etc. So there are a lot of events. You don't need to remember the name of these events. Again, you can Google it at any point of time. Some of the very basic events we will see ourselves, and then more practice you do, the more understanding of the events we'll get. The second argument is going to be a callback function, which will be executed once the event is triggered. So you are going to mention a callback method, which is going to be executed once the event is triggered altogether. Okay, cool. So let's see this with an example. Let's say you have this input button submit. Okay, right? You can say const submit btn is equals to document.getElementById submit. And now submit btn is an HTML element. I can say submit btn dot add event listener. This is a function, and it will take two arguments. First argument is the name of the event. So you can see there are a lot of event names automatically VS Code is recommending. So all of your VS Codes will also recommend these events. You can see about, animation, cancel, blur, cancel, can play, close. You can see wheel, waiting, pointer, leave. A lot of things are there. I will say click. So there's an event called as click. And it takes a callback method. It takes a callback method altogether. Right. If I say console.log, button is click. Button is click. Okay. And I would like to change this input to a button for a moment again. Why I'm changing this input to a button, you will realize in some time. Okay, so I've changed it to a button. Why I'm changing it to a button? Because if I keep this as an input tag, then the default behavior of the submit button of an input tag or submit input of an input, form tag is that it refreshes the page. I will show you how later you can stop refreshing the page by using input tag also, input submit also. But for now, I keep this as a button. Now, if I click on this button, okay, so this is still updating. So let's remove the font tag for a moment. I'm removing the font tag for a moment. Okay, so now let's click on this button. Now, can you see? Button is clicked. Button is clicked. And when is this printed? When I clicked on the button. Let me show you again. If I click on the button, sorry, you can see button is clicked. If I click on the button again, button is clicked. So when and by default, if the page, if you refresh the page and you come to the page, this function will never be automatically executed. This function will be executed if and only when you click on that particular button. That's an interesting part. Okay. Again, mentioning I've removed the form tag because by default the button click submits the form and refreshes the page. There's a way to stop that using a method called as prevent default, but I'll come to that later. So for now, I have just I would say commented the form tag. But here you can see what we have done is a very simple thing. We selected a button called add event listener. It takes two arguments. First argument is the name of the event. Second argument is the function. This function will not be automatically executed. This will be only executed once this event happens on this element. When the click event happens on the submit button, then this function is executed. And you can see, if I click here, you can see something is happening, right? So this is what we are talking about. Okay. So this callback method will not be automatically called. It will be only called when click event happens on the submit BPN altogether. Right? It will not automatically execute. Right? And that's what event-driven programming is. For example, if I change click to DBL click, now what will happen is if I click it once, you can see nothing is happening. I again click it, nothing is happening. But if I make a double click, when I make a double click, then this button is being clicked. Then this button is being clicked. Right? So there are a lot of these kind of events. For example, I'll show you later. Like a few more concepts you have to understand. But this is the main thing. That in event-driven programming, you have to first of all specify which element you want to listen to. Like on which, because on every element, a lot of events keep on happening. Like even when we do not register this callback function, still these events are executed. But nobody is telling our HTML page to what to do on these events. For example, when I'm moving my mouse, still a lot of events are being triggered, but nothing is happening on that because we have not registered anything. This is kind of like registering an event listener. This callback method is also called as a event listener. This callback method is sometimes also referred as event listener altogether, right? Okay. So that's the part that whenever at any point of time you want to trigger a function, but not automatically. When something happens on the page, that's where your events come into the picture. You will select an element, add an event listener to that element, give the name of the event on which you want to keep on listening. That okay, once the click event happens, then I will execute a function, and then mention which particular event listener you want to execute, and that's it. This is how you do event-driven programming in your DOM. Make sense, everybody? Can we say that clicking is the function? No, clicking is the event. Okay, you guys tell me. How many of you guys have ever driven a car or a bike? कभी कार और बाइक चलाई है? Okay. कार स्टार्ट कब होती है? When does the car start? जब चाबी लगाते हैं, जब चाबी घुमाते हैं, तब कार इग्नाइट होती है ना. ऐसे थोड़ी कार बाहर खड़ी है, चाबी हमारे हाथ में है, देख रहे हैं कार को और कार अपने आप चल जाएगी. ऐसा तो नहीं होगा. You have to go inside the car, put the key and roll the key. When you roll the key, that's an event. And what is the consequence of that event? That the car ignites. हाँ, ये बटन से भी चल जाती है. बटन दबाना पड़ता है ना, घूरो के बटन को तो चल जाएगी. हैं? यार तो देखता हूँ 10 मिनट के लिए कार को, क्या पता देखते ही चल जाए, तो तुम्हारा देखना ही इवेंट हो जाएगा फिर. तो इवेंट और इवेंट लिस्टनर का फर्क क्या है? इवेंट है रोलिंग ऑफ द की, कि जब रोलिंग ऑफ द की होगी तो हम क्या करेंगे? कार को इग्नाइट कर देंगे. रिमोट से भी स्टार्ट होती है सर. तुम्हारे पास रिमोट से स्टार्ट होने वाली गाड़ी है तो तुम कोर्ट में क्यों पढ़ रहे हो भाई? है, तुमको एम्प्लॉयमेंट देने के बारे में सोचो अगर तुम्हारे पास रिमोट से चलने वाली गाड़ी है. ठीक है. यहाँ तक समझ में आ रहा है सबको? ठीक है, सही लगा अभी तक? मतलब अब ये सब कॉन्सेप्ट डीएसए वगैरह से इजी होते हैं, तो इसमें इतना फायदा नहीं लगता. ठीक है, चलो काम करके थोड़ा ब्रेक लेते हैं. ब्रेक के बाद हम लोग और कॉन्सेप्ट देखेंगे. और अब इस बटन के क्लिक पे अब हम लोग को क्या करना है? व्हाट वी वांट टू डू इज व्हेन वी क्लिक ऑन दिस बटन, व्हाटएवर इज द टेक्स्ट रिटन हियर,